The control tower fell silent as Captain William Harrison's weathered hands gripped the yoke of Flight 847. Outside, Hurricane Delilah screamed across the Atlantic with winds reaching 180 miles per hour, turning the sky into a churning nightmare of black clouds and deadly turbulence. 312 souls sat behind him in the cabin, their lives hanging in the balance as the Boeing 777 bucked and rolled through the storm like a toy in a washing machine. The fuel gauge showed critical levels, and every airport within 500 miles had closed their runways. At 67 years old, Harrison had become the oldest commercial pilot still flying for TransGlobal Airways, and for months his colleagues had whispered that he was too old, too slow, too outdated for modern aviation. But in this moment, as lightning split the darkness around them and the aircraft shuddered under nature's fury, those same colleagues would witness why experience could never be replaced by youth, and why sometimes the oldest eagle soars the highest when the storm threatens to ground every other bird in the sky. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Captain William Harrison had been flying for 43 years, accumulating over 30,000 flight hours across every type of aircraft imaginable. He'd started his career in 1981 as a young bush pilot in Alaska, ferrying supplies to remote mining camps and oil rigs scattered across the frozen wilderness. Those early years had been unforgiving, teaching him to read weather patterns like ancient mariners read the stars, to feel the subtle changes in engine performance through the solace of his feet, and to make split-second decisions when mechanical failures occurred hundreds of miles from the nearest landing strip. The Alaskan wilderness had no patience for hesitation or textbook solutions, and Harrison had learned to trust his instincts above all else. After a decade of bush flying, he'd transitioned to commercial aviation, joining Regional Air Express as a first officer on turboprop aircraft serving smaller cities across the Pacific Northwest. The move had been motivated by his desire to start a family with his wife Margaret, a schoolteacher he'd met in Anchorage. Flying scheduled routes meant regular paychecks, predictable schedules, and the possibility of being home for dinner more than twice a month. Harrison had embraced the structured world of commercial aviation, studying regulations with the same intensity he'd once reserved for weather patterns, and earning his captain's stripes at the unusually young age of 32. The early years at Regional Air Express had been challenging in different ways than bush flying. Instead of fighting against nature's unpredictability, Harrison had to navigate the complex hierarchies of airline management, union politics, and the constant pressure to maintain on-time performance while never compromising safety. He'd quickly earned a reputation as a pilot who could handle difficult weather conditions that grounded other flights, often volunteering to take the challenging routes that less experienced captains avoided. His ability to land safely and cross winds that exceeded normal limits, or to navigate around storm systems that appeared impenetrable to radar, had made him valuable to the airline's operations department. In 1995, TransGlobal Airways had acquired Regional Air Express, and Harrison had found himself flying much larger aircraft on international routes. The transition from 50-passenger turboprops to 200-seat jets had required extensive retraining, but Harrison had approached it with the same methodical determination that had served him throughout his career. He'd studied the new aircraft systems until he could operate them blindfolded, practiced emergency procedures until his responses became automatic, and spent countless hours in flight simulators, perfecting his technique on the Boeing 737s and 757s that formed the backbone of TransGlobal's domestic fleet. The years had been kind to Harrison's career, if not always to his personal life. Margaret had given birth to their daughter Sarah in 1987, and their son Michael had followed 2 years later. Harrison had tried to balance his demanding schedule with family responsibilities, But the nature of commercial aviation meant missing school plays, birthday parties, and family vacations. Margaret had been understanding, recognizing that Harrison's dedication to his profession was driven not by ambition, but by a genuine love of flying and an unwavering commitment to safety. She'd managed the household during his frequent absences, raising their children to understand that their father's work was important, and that his time away was a sacrifice he made for their security. By 2010, Harrison had accumulated enough seniority to bid on the most prestigious routes in TransGlobal's network. He'd transitioned to the Boeing 777, the airline's flagship aircraft used for long-haul international flights. The 777 was a technological marvel, equipped with advanced weather radar, satellite communication systems, and fly-by-wire controls that could compensate for pilot error or extreme weather conditions. Harrison had initially been skeptical of the aircraft's heavy reliance on computer systems, preferring the mechanical feedback of older aircraft where he could feel every change in the plane's attitude through the controls. However, he'd gradually learned to work with the 777's sophisticated systems, using them to enhance rather than replace his own judgment and experience. The transition to international flying had brought new challenges and rewards. Harrison had flown routes across the Pacific to Tokyo, Sydney, and Hong Kong, navigating the complex air traffic control systems of different countries and adapting to varying weather patterns across multiple time zones. He'd also flown transatlantic routes to London, Paris, and Frankfurt, dealing with the dense air traffic over the North Atlantic and the unpredictable weather systems that could spawn severe turbulence with little warning. Each route had its own characteristics and dangers, from the typhoons that swept across the Pacific to the winter storms that could turn a routine flight to Europe into a battle for survival. Throughout his career, Harrison had maintained an impeccable safety record. He'd never had a serious incident, never been involved in an accident, and had received commendations from both the airline and the Federal Aviation Administration for his handling of several emergency situations. In 2008, he'd successfully landed a 777 at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport after a bird strike had damaged one engine shortly after takeoff. The emergency landing had been executed flawlessly, with passengers later praising Harrison's calm demeanor and clear communication throughout the crisis. In 2012, he diverted a flight to Anchorage when a passenger had suffered a heart attack over the Pacific, coordinating with air traffic control and medical personnel to ensure the passenger received immediate treatment upon landing. Despite his exemplary record, Harrison had begun to face subtle pressure to retire as he approached his mid-60s. The airline industry had changed dramatically during his career, with younger pilots fresh from flight schools bringing different perspectives and training methods. Many of these newer pilots had grown up with advanced computer systems and glass cockpits, adapting more easily to the latest technological innovations in aircraft design. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They'd trained on flight simulators that could replicate any conceivable emergency scenario, giving them theoretical experience with situations that Harrison had learned to handle through decades of real-world flying. The generational divide had become more apparent during Harrison's annual proficiency checks and recurrent training sessions. Younger Czech pilots, some barely half his age, would occasionally make subtle comments about his methodical approach to pre-flight procedures, or his preference for manual flying over automated systems. They'd suggest that he was being overly cautious or that his techniques were outdated compared to modern best practices. While Harrison had always passed these evaluations with flying colors, he'd begun to sense that his age was being viewed as a liability rather than an asset. The situation had been exacerbated by industry-wide discussions about pilot retirement ages, and the ongoing debate over whether experience could compensate for the natural decline in reflexes and cognitive function that came with aging. Several high-profile incidents involving older pilots had led to increased scrutiny of age-related factors in aviation safety, with some aviation experts arguing that mandatory retirement ages should be lowered to ensure optimal performance in critical situations. Harrison had found himself defending not just his own capabilities, but the value of experience in an industry that was increasingly focused on standardization and technology-driven solutions. The pressure had intensified 6 months earlier when TransGlobal Airways had announced a voluntary early retirement program designed to reduce labor costs and create advancement opportunities for younger pilots. The program offered attractive financial incentives for pilots over 65 to retire immediately, with enhanced pension benefits and healthcare coverage. Harrison's chief pilot, Captain Robert Chun, had approached him privately to discuss the option, suggesting that it might be an ideal time to step away from flying while his reputation remained intact. The conversation had been cordial but pointed, with Chun emphasizing that the industry was evolving rapidly and that pilots needed to adapt or risk being left behind. Harrison had politely declined the early retirement offer, explaining that he felt he still had valuable contributions to make and that his experience could benefit both the airline and the passengers he served. He'd pointed to his safety record, his ability to handle challenging weather conditions, and his mentoring of younger pilots as evidence that age had not diminished his effectiveness. Chun had accepted his decision gracefully, but Harrison had sensed that his refusal had been noted by airline management and that his future with TransGlobal Airways might be more precarious than he'd previously realized. The whispers had become more frequent and less subtle over the following months. In crew lounges and during layovers, Harrison had overheard conversations about older pilots who'd made mistakes or shown signs of declining performance. While these discussions were never directed at him personally, the implication was clear that age was becoming a significant factor in how pilots were evaluated and assigned to flights. Some of his younger colleagues had begun to question whether Harrison's methodical approach to flying was appropriate for the fast-paced demands of modern commercial aviation, where efficiency and adherence to standardized procedures were often prioritized over individual experience and judgment. The criticism had reached a crescendo 3 weeks earlier during a routine flight from Seattle to Amsterdam. Harrison had been flying as captain with First Officer Jennifer Martinez, a 34-year-old pilot with impressive credentials and a reputation for technical precision. During the flight, they'd encountered moderate turbulence over the North Atlantic, and Harrison had made the decision to request a course deviation to avoid a developing storm system that wasn't showing clearly on their weather radar. Martinez had questioned the deviation, pointing out that their flight plan had been carefully calculated to optimize fuel consumption and that the turbulence they were experiencing was well within acceptable limits for continued flight. Harrison had explained his reasoning, drawing on his decades of experience reading weather patterns and his knowledge of how storms could develop rapidly over the Atlantic. He'd emphasized that the safety of their passengers should always take precedence over schedule adherence or fuel efficiency, and that his instincts were telling him that the storm ahead was more severe than their instruments indicated. Martinez had reluctantly agreed to the course change, but Harrison had sensed her frustration with what she perceived as an unnecessary and costly deviation from their planned route. The flight had completed successfully without incident, but Harrison had later learned that Martinez had filed a report questioning his decision-making process. She'd suggested that his course deviation had been based on outdated flying techniques rather than current weather information, and that his reluctance to trust the aircraft's advanced weather detection systems might indicate a decline in his ability to adapt to modern aviation practices. The report had been reviewed by the airline's safety department, and while no formal action had been taken, Harrison had been called in for a meeting with the chief pilot to discuss the incident. During that meeting, Shun had been diplomatic but firm in his assessment. He'd acknowledged Harrison's extensive experience and his outstanding safety record, but he'd also expressed concern about the perception that Harrison was becoming resistant to modern flying techniques and overly reliant on intuition rather than data-driven decision-making. Shun had suggested that Harrison might benefit from additional training on the 777's advanced systems, particularly the weather radar and automated flight management systems that were designed to optimize flight paths and fuel consumption. Harrison had agreed to the additional training, recognizing that his career depended on demonstrating his ability to adapt to evolving industry standards. However, he'd also felt frustrated by the implication that his experience was becoming a liability rather than an asset. He'd spent decades learning to read the subtle signs that instruments often missed, developing an intuitive understanding of aircraft behavior that couldn't be programmed into a computer system. The idea that this knowledge was somehow obsolete or dangerous struck him as fundamentally misguided, but he'd recognized that arguing the point would only reinforce perceptions about his inflexibility. The training sessions had been conducted by instructors who were half his age, most of whom had learned to fly in an era where advanced avionics and automated systems were standard equipment. They'd emphasized the importance of following standardized procedures and trusting the aircraft's sophisticated systems to provide accurate information about weather conditions, aircraft performance, and optimal flight paths. Harrison had participated actively in the training, demonstrating his ability to use the advanced systems effectively, but he'd also maintained his belief that human judgment and experience remained essential elements of safe flying. The irony of the situation had not been lost on Harrison. He'd been flying for longer than most of his instructors had been alive, had accumulated more flight hours than many of them would achieve in their entire careers, and had successfully handled emergency situations that they'd only experienced in simulators. Yet he was being treated as if his experience was a handicap rather than a strength, and his proven ability to make sound decisions under pressure was being questioned because it didn't always align with computer-generated recommendations. Situation had come to a head 2 weeks earlier when Harrison had been assigned to Flight 847, a routine transatlantic route from New York's John F. Kennedy International Airport to London's Heathrow Airport. The flight was scheduled to depart at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Time, arriving in London at 7:45 a.m. local time the following morning. It was a route Harrison had flown hundreds of times, and he'd been looking forward to what he'd expected to be a straightforward overnight crossing of the Atlantic. The weather forecast for the route had been typical for late October, with scattered clouds and moderate winds over the North Atlantic. There had been no significant weather systems predicted along their planned flight path, and the crossing was expected to be smooth and uneventful. Harrison had completed his pre-flight planning with his usual thoroughness, reviewing weather reports, calculating fuel requirements, and studying the route for any potential hazards or areas of concern. Everything had appeared normal, and he'd had no reason to expect that this flight would be different from the thousands of others he'd completed successfully throughout his career. However, as Harrison had prepared for what he'd assumed would be a routine flight, meteorologists at the National Hurricane Center in Miami had been tracking a rapidly intensifying tropical storm system in the mid-Atlantic. Hurricane Delilah, as it would later be named, was developing with unprecedented speed and violence, transforming from a tropical depression to a major hurricane in less than 18 hours. The storm's rapid intensification had caught weather forecasters off guard, and its projected path was shifting constantly as it gained strength and began moving northward toward the heavily traveled transatlantic air corridors. The failure of weather prediction models to accurately forecast Hurricane Delilah's development would later be attributed to a combination of factors, including unusually warm ocean temperatures, favorable upper-level wind patterns, and the interaction between multiple weather systems that had created ideal conditions for rapid cyclogenesis. The storm's compact size and intense circulation had made it difficult to track accurately, and its northward movement had been faster than initially predicted, putting it on a collision course with several major air routes between North America and Europe. As Flight 847 had prepared for departure from JFK, the first warnings about Hurricane Delilah were just beginning to reach air traffic control centers and airline operations departments. The storm was still classified as a tropical storm rather than a hurricane, and its projected path was uncertain enough that it wasn't expected to significantly impact transatlantic flight operations. However, experienced meteorologists were beginning to recognize the signs of a potentially dangerous system, and some were recommending that flights be diverted or delayed until the storm's behavior could be better understood. Harrison had been conducting his pre-flight inspection of the Boeing 777 when he'd first heard about the developing weather system. A ground crew supervisor had mentioned that there was a tropical storm somewhere in the Atlantic, but had indicated that it wasn't expected to affect their flight path. Harrison had made a mental note to review the latest weather information once he'd completed his inspection, but his initial assessment had been that they were dealing with a routine weather system that could be easily avoided with minor course adjustments if necessary. The Boeing 777-300ER, assigned to Flight 847, was one of TransGlobal Airways' newest aircraft, delivered just 2 years earlier and equipped with the most advanced avionics and safety systems available. The aircraft was configured with 312 seats across 3 classes, with 42 seats in business class, 24 in premium economy, and 246 in economy class. On this particular flight, the aircraft was carrying 307 passengers and 12 crew members, making it nearly at full capacity for the transatlantic crossing. The passenger manifest had reflected the typical mix of travelers on a New York to London route. There were business executives traveling to meetings in London, tourists beginning European vacations, students studying abroad, and families visiting relatives. Among the passengers were Dr. Sarah Chun, a pediatric surgeon traveling to present research at a medical conference in London; Marcus Thompson, a software engineer relocating to TransGlobal's London office; and Elena Rodriguez, a retired teacher visiting her daughter who lived in England. Each passenger had their own reasons for making the journey, their own plans and expectations for what should have been a routine overnight flight across the Atlantic. The crew for Flight 847 had been typical of TransGlobal's international operations. First Officer Jennifer Martinez, despite her earlier conflict with Harrison, had been assigned to the flight as his co-pilot. Martinez was known for her technical competence and adherence to procedures, and Harrison had hoped that working together on a routine flight might help resolve some of the tensions that had developed between them. The cabin crew had been led by Purser Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran of TransGlobal Airways, who was known for her professionalism and ability to handle difficult passengers or emergency situations. As passengers had boarded Flight 847, Hurricane Delilah had continued to intensify in the mid-Atlantic, its winds reaching 90 miles per hour and its forward speed increasing as it moved northward. The storm's compact structure and rapid intensification had made it difficult for meteorologists to predict its exact path, and the various weather models were showing significantly different scenarios for where the hurricane might track over the next 24 hours. Some models predicted that the storm would continue moving northward and eventually weaken as it encountered cooler water temperatures, while others suggested that it might strengthen further and move toward the northeast, potentially affecting the busy transatlantic air corridors. Harrison had reviewed the latest weather reports during the boarding process, noting that there was now a hurricane in the Atlantic, but that its projected path was still well south of their planned route. The forecast had called for clear skies, and light winds for the first half of their flight, with some scattered clouds and moderate turbulence possible as they approached the European coast. Nothing in the weather briefing had suggested that Flight 847 would encounter any significant challenges during the crossing, and Harrison had been confident that they would have a smooth and uneventful flight to London. The departure from JFK had proceeded normally, with Flight 847 pushing back from the gate at 8:25 p.m., 5 minutes ahead of schedule. The taxi to the runway had been routine, and they'd been cleared for takeoff on runway 4L at 8:47 p.m. Harrison had performed the takeoff himself, lifting the heavily loaded 777 into the evening sky with the smooth precision that came from decades of experience. The aircraft had climbed steadily through the departure procedure, turning eastward over Long Island and beginning the long journey across the Atlantic Ocean. As Flight 847 had reached its initial cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, Hurricane Delilah had been undergoing explosive intensification approximately 800 miles to the southeast. The storm's winds had increased to 120 miles per hour, making it a Category 3 hurricane, and its forward speed had accelerated to nearly 25 miles per hour. The hurricane's rapid strengthening had surprised meteorologists, who had expected it to weaken as it moved over cooler waters. Instead, the storm had continued to gain strength and had begun to track more toward the northeast than originally predicted, putting it on a potential collision course with the North Atlantic air routes. The first indication that something was wrong had come about 2 hours into the flight, when air traffic control had contacted Flight 847 with a routine position report and weather update. The controller had mentioned that there was a strengthening hurricane in the Atlantic, and that some flights were being advised to consider minor course adjustments to avoid potential turbulence. Harrison had acknowledged the information and had requested the latest weather radar data, which had shown Hurricane Delilah as a well-defined spiral of clouds, still several hundred miles to the south of their position. Harrison had studied the radar imagery carefully, noting the storm's compact structure and the intense convective activity surrounding its eye. His experience with weather systems had told him that this was not a typical hurricane and that its rapid intensification and northward movement were cause for concern. While the storm was still projected to pass well south of their route, Harrison had recognized that hurricane tracks could change rapidly and that the storm's influence could extend far beyond its visible boundaries. First Officer Martinez had reviewed the same weather information and had concluded that the hurricane posed no immediate threat to their flight. She'd pointed out that the storm was still hundreds of miles away and that their planned route would keep them well clear of any severe weather. Martinez had also noted that their fuel load was carefully calculated for the planned route, and that significant course deviations could create fuel management issues that might force them to divert to an alternate airport. Harrison had acknowledged Martinez's assessment, but had continued to monitor the storm's progress closely. His instincts, honed by decades of flying in challenging weather conditions, had been telling him that Hurricane Delilah was going to be a problem. The storm's rapid intensification and erratic movement patterns had reminded him of other dangerous weather systems he'd encountered, and he'd begun to consider contingency plans in case the situation deteriorated. The tension between Harrison and Martinez had been palpable as they'd continued eastward across the Atlantic. Martinez had seemed frustrated by what she perceived as Harrison's excessive concern about a storm that was still far from their position, while Harrison had felt that his co-pilot was being dangerously complacent about a rapidly evolving weather situation. The generational divide that had been simmering throughout their professional relationship had begun to surface, with Martinez representing the new generation of pilots who relied heavily on technology and standardized procedures, while Harrison embodied the older school of flying that emphasized experience and intuition. As Flight 847 had progressed deeper into the Atlantic, Hurricane Delilah had continued its unprecedented rapid intensification. The storm's winds had reached 155 miles per hour, making it a Category 4 hurricane, and its forward speed had increased to over 30 miles per hour. More concerning was the storm's track, which had shifted significantly northward and was now projected to intersect with the heavily traveled North Atlantic air corridors. The hurricane's influence was extending far beyond its visible boundaries, creating severe turbulence and dangerous wind conditions across a much wider area than originally predicted. Weather forecasters at the National Hurricane Center had begun issuing urgent advisories about the storm's unexpected behavior, warning that aircraft in the North Atlantic should be prepared for severe turbulence and possible wind shear conditions. However, the rapid pace of the storm's development had made it difficult for updated weather information to reach aircraft already in flight, and many pilots were unaware of just how dangerous the situation was becoming. Harrison had been monitoring the aircraft's weather radar continuously, noting subtle changes in the cloud patterns ahead of them that suggested the presence of severe weather. The radar display had shown scattered areas of precipitation, but the system's limitations had made it difficult to detect the full extent of the turbulence and wind shear that Hurricane Delilah was generating. Harrison's experience had told him that the relatively benign radar returns were masking much more dangerous conditions, and he'd begun to feel increasingly uneasy about their situation. The first direct contact with the outer bands of Hurricane Delilah's influence had come at approximately 11:30 p.m., when Flight 847 had encountered moderate turbulence that had caused the aircraft to pitch and roll unexpectedly. The initial turbulence had been brief but violent, causing several passengers to spill drinks and prompting the cabin crew to begin securing loose items throughout the aircraft. Harrison had immediately turned on the seatbelt sign and had made an announcement asking passengers to remain seated with their seatbelts fastened. Martinez had seemed surprised by the sudden onset of turbulence, checking the weather radar display and finding no significant returns in their immediate vicinity. She'd suggested that they might have encountered an isolated convective cell or some clear air turbulence, both of which were relatively common over the North Atlantic. Harrison had agreed that the turbulence might be isolated, but his growing concern about Hurricane Delilah had made him more cautious about their continued progress along the planned route. The situation had deteriorated rapidly over the next 30 minutes, with Flight 847 encountering increasingly severe turbulence that had made it difficult to maintain level flight. The aircraft had been buffeted by powerful wind currents that had caused significant altitude deviations, and the ride had become so rough that several passengers had become airsick. Harrison had reduced the aircraft's speed and had begun looking for smoother air at different altitudes, but the turbulence had seemed to extend through multiple flight levels. It had been at this point that Harrison had made the decision that would later be criticized by airline management and praised by aviation safety experts. Despite Martinez's objections and concerns about fuel consumption, Harrison had requested clearance from air traffic control to deviate significantly from their planned route, taking Flight 847 on a more northerly path that would add approximately 200 miles to their journey, but would potentially avoid the worst of the turbulence associated with Hurricane Delilah. The request had been met with initial resistance from air traffic control, who had been dealing with multiple aircraft requesting route changes due to weather conditions. The controller had suggested that Flight 847 try a different altitude instead of a route deviation, pointing out that other aircraft in the area were managing to continue on their planned routes despite the turbulence. Harrison had insisted on the route change, explaining that his assessment of the weather conditions indicated that the turbulence was likely to worsen, and that the safety of his passengers required immediate action. Martinez had been visibly frustrated by Harrison's decision, arguing that the route deviation would create significant fuel management issues and that they might not have enough fuel to reach London if they encountered additional delays or routing. changes. She'd pointed out that their fuel load had been calculated precisely for the planned route, with standard reserves for holding patterns and possible diversions to alternate airports. The additional 200 miles that Harrison's route deviation would add to their journey would consume a significant portion of their fuel reserves, potentially forcing them to divert to an alternate airport in Iceland or Ireland. Harrison had acknowledged Martinez's concerns, but had maintained that avoiding the severe weather was worth the risk of a fuel-related diversion. He'd calculated that they would still have adequate fuel to reach London if they encountered no further delays, and that the risk of structural damage or passenger injuries from severe turbulence was greater than the risk of having to make an unscheduled fuel stop. His decision had been based on his assessment of the overall situation rather than strict adherence to fuel management procedures, and he'd been willing to accept the consequences of his choice. The route deviation had initially seemed to improve their situation, with Flight 847 encountering smoother air as they'd moved away from their original track. Harrison had begun to feel vindicated in his decision, and even Martinez had seemed to acknowledge that the ride had become more comfortable for passengers. However, their relief had been short-lived, as Hurricane Delilah's rapid movement and expanding influence had meant that the storm's effects were spreading across a much wider area than anyone had anticipated. The true scope of the crisis had become apparent when air traffic control had begun issuing urgent advisories about Hurricane Delilah's unprecedented behavior. The storm had not only intensified to Category 5 strength with winds exceeding 180 miles per hour, but it had also accelerated its forward movement to over 40 miles per hour and had continued tracking northward toward the transatlantic air corridors. The hurricane's influence was now extending over an area of more than 300 miles in diameter, creating dangerous flying conditions across multiple air routes. More critically, the storm's rapid movement had caught ground-based weather forecasters off guard, and the projected path had shifted dramatically from the original predictions. Hurricane Delilah was now expected to pass directly through the North Atlantic air corridors, creating conditions that would make it impossible for aircraft to continue on their planned routes. The storm's unprecedented size and intensity had prompted aviation authorities to begin closing airports across the North Atlantic region, with facilities in Iceland, Ireland, and the United Kingdom beginning to suspend operations as the hurricane approached. Harrison had received this information with a growing sense of dread, realizing that Flight 847 was now trapped in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with a Category 5 hurricane bearing down on them and no available airports within their remaining fuel range. The route deviation that had seemed prudent an hour earlier had now become a potential death sentence, as it had consumed precious fuel that they would need to reach any alternate destination. The situation had transformed from a routine weather avoidance maneuver into a fight for survival, with 319 souls depending on Harrison's ability to navigate them through one of the most dangerous storms ever recorded in the North Atlantic. First indication of just how serious their situation had become had come when air traffic control had contacted Flight 847 with an urgent message about airport closures. The controller had informed them that Heathrow Airport in London had suspended all arrivals due to severe weather conditions, and that several other airports in the United Kingdom and Ireland were also beginning to close their runways. The controller had asked Harrison to confirm their fuel status and to indicate whether they would be able to reach an alternate destination if London remained closed. Harrison had quickly calculated their remaining fuel, factoring in the extra distance they'd flown due to the route deviation and the additional fuel they'd consumed fighting headwinds and turbulence. The numbers had been sobering. They had approximately 4 hours of fuel remaining, which would normally be sufficient to reach London with adequate reserves. However, with London closed and other nearby airports also suspending operations, their options were rapidly diminishing. Martinez had been studying the fuel calculations as well, and her concern had been evident as she'd realized the implications of their situation. The route deviation that she'd opposed had consumed approximately 45 minutes worth of fuel, which would normally have been manageable but was now critical given the closure of their destination airport. She'd suggested that they might be able to reach Reykjavik, Iceland, which was approximately 500 miles to the north of their current position, but even that option would require them to fly through increasingly severe weather conditions. The decision of where to go had been complicated by the fact that Hurricane Delilah's influence was continuing to expand, and weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly across the entire North Atlantic region. Airports in Iceland were reporting severe crosswinds and turbulence, while facilities in Ireland and Scotland were beginning to experience the outer bands of the hurricane circulation. The storm's rapid movement meant that conditions were changing faster than weather forecasts could be updated, making it difficult to determine which airports would remain open long enough for Flight 847 to reach them safely. Harrison had been forced to make a series of rapid decisions based on incomplete information and constantly changing conditions. His experience had told him that their best chance of survival lay in staying ahead of the storm rather than trying to outrun it to a specific destination. He decided to continue northward toward Iceland while monitoring weather conditions at various airports, hoping to find a facility that remained open long enough for them to land safely. The challenge had been compounded by the fact that their fuel reserves were now critically low, leaving them with no margin for error in their navigation or destination selection. Every mile they flew in the wrong direction could mean the difference between reaching safety and running out of fuel over the open ocean. Harrison had been forced to balance the need to avoid the worst of the storm's effects with the imperative to reach a suitable airport before their fuel was exhausted. As Flight 847 had continued northward through increasingly turbulent skies, Hurricane Delilah had continued its relentless advance across the North Atlantic. The storm's eye had been clearly visible on satellite imagery, a massive spiral of destruction that was churning toward the very corridors that Harrison was trying to navigate. The hurricane's winds had reached an unprecedented 185 miles per hour, making it one of the strongest storms ever recorded in the Atlantic Basin, and its forward speed had increased to over 45 miles per hour. The storm's influence had been felt far beyond its visible boundaries, creating severe turbulence, dangerous wind shear, and massive waves across an area spanning more than 500 miles. Aircraft that had attempted to fly through the hurricane's outer bands had reported structural damage, severe turbulence that had injured passengers and crew, and in some cases, complete loss of control that had forced emergency landings at the nearest available airports. Harrison had been monitoring radio communications from other aircraft in the region, and the reports had been increasingly alarming. A cargo flight had declared an emergency after encountering severe turbulence that had damaged its control surfaces, forcing it to divert to an airport in Canada. A passenger flight had reported losing altitude control while flying through the storm's outer bands, with the aircraft dropping nearly 3,000 feet in a matter of seconds before the pilots had been able to regain control. The situation had reached a critical point when air traffic control had contacted Flight 847 with devastating news about airport closures across the North Atlantic region. Reykjavik Airport in Iceland had suspended all operations due to crosswinds exceeding 60 knots, while airports in Ireland and Scotland had also closed their runways as Hurricane Delilah's influence had spread across the region. The controller had asked Harrison to confirm their fuel status and to indicate their intentions, as there were now no available airports within their remaining fuel range. Harrison had felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders as he'd realized the full extent of their predicament. Flight 847 was now trapped in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean with a Category 5 hurricane bearing down on them, critically low fuel reserves, and no available airports within reach. The 319 people behind him in the cabin were depending on his ability to find a solution to what appeared to be an impossible situation, and the margin for error had been reduced to zero. The breakthrough had come when Harrison had remembered a conversation he'd had several years earlier with a fellow pilot who had flown supply missions to weather stations in the Arctic. The pilot had mentioned that there were several remote airstrips in Greenland that were used for scientific research and emergency situations, including one at Kangerlussuaq that had a runway long enough to accommodate large commercial aircraft. The airstrip had been built during World War II as a refueling stop for aircraft transiting between North America and Europe, and while it had been largely abandoned after the war, it had been maintained by the Danish government for emergency use and scientific operations. The Kangerlussuaq airstrip was located on the west coast of Greenland, approximately 400 miles north of their current position. More importantly, it was situated in a location that would be shielded from the worst effects of Hurricane Delilah by Greenland's massive ice sheet and mountainous terrain. While the weather conditions at Kangerlussuaq would certainly be challenging, with strong crosswinds and possible snow squalls, they would be manageable compared to the hurricane-force winds and severe turbulence that Flight 847 would encounter if they continued trying to reach airports in Iceland or Europe. Harrison had quickly calculated the fuel requirements for a diversion to Kangerlussuaq, factoring in the distance, expected headwinds, and the fuel they would need for approach and landing procedures. The numbers had been tight but feasible. They would arrive with approximately 30 minutes of fuel remaining, which was barely above minimum reserves, but sufficient for a safe landing if everything went according to plan. The margin for error would be minimal, but it represented their best and possibly only chance of survival. Martinez had initially been skeptical of Harrison's proposal to divert to an abandoned airstrip in Greenland that wasn't even listed in their flight planning documents. She'd pointed out that they had no information about the current condition of the runway, the availability of ground support equipment, or the facilities that would be needed to handle 319 passengers and crew in one of the most remote locations on Earth. Martinez had also expressed concern about the weather conditions they might encounter during the approach to Kangerlussuaq, noting that Arctic weather could be extremely unpredictable and that they would have no backup options if the landing attempt failed. Harrison had acknowledged Martinez's concerns, but had emphasized that they were facing a choice between certain death and uncertain survival. Hurricane Delilah had made it impossible to reach any conventional airport within their fuel range, and the storm's continued expansion meant that conditions would only get worse as time passed. The diversion to Kangerlussuaq represented a calculated risk based on Harrison's assessment of their options, and he'd been convinced that it offered their best chance of getting everyone on board to safety. The decision to divert to Kangerlussuaq had required Harrison to contact air traffic control and request permission to deviate from their assigned route and altitude. The controller had initially been confused by the request, as Kangerlussuaq was not a standard diversion airport for commercial flights and was not equipped with the navigation aids and support services that airlines typically required. However, when Harrison had explained their fuel situation and the closure of conventional airports due to Hurricane Delilah, the controller had quickly understood the gravity of their situation and had approved the course change. The controller had also provided Harrison with what limited information was available about current conditions at Kangerlussuaq. The weather station there was reporting winds from the northeast at 25 knots with gusts to 40 knots, visibility of 10 miles with scattered snow showers, and a temperature of -15 degrees Celsius. The runway was listed as being 9,000 feet long and 150 feet wide, which was adequate for the Boeing 777, but there was no information about its current condition or whether it had been cleared of snow and ice. More concerning was the lack of ground support equipment and passenger facilities at Kangerlussuaq. The airstrip had a small terminal building that was primarily used by researchers and military personnel, but it was not equipped to handle nearly 320 passengers from a commercial flight. There were no jet bridges, baggage handling systems, or catering facilities, and the heating capacity of the terminal building was designed for perhaps 50 people at most. Harrison had realized that even if they managed to land safely, keeping 319 people warm and fed in the Arctic environment would present significant challenges. Despite these concerns, Harrison had been convinced that reaching Kangerlussuaq alive was preferable to the alternatives they were facing. The storm was continuing to intensify and spread across the North Atlantic, making it increasingly unlikely that any conventional airport would remain open long enough for them to reach it safely. The fuel calculations had also been becoming more critical by the minute, as headwinds and turbulence were causing them to consume fuel faster than planned. The flight toward Kangerlussuaq had been a harrowing experience that had tested every aspect of Harrison's flying skills and judgment. Hurricane Delilah's influence had extended much farther north than originally predicted, subjecting Flight 847 to severe turbulence and dangerous wind conditions throughout their approach to Greenland. The aircraft had been buffeted by powerful wind currents that had made it extremely difficult to maintain course and altitude, and several times Harrison had been forced to make significant corrections to prevent the aircraft from being blown off course. The turbulence had been so severe that many passengers had become violently airsick, and the cabin crew had been forced to secure themselves in their seats for extended periods, rather than attempting to provide service or assistance. Several passengers had been injured when they were thrown against their seatbelts during particularly violent episodes of turbulence, and the medical kit had been brought out multiple times to treat cuts and bruises. The aircraft structure had been stressed to its limits, with the wings flexing visibly during some of the worst turbulence and the fuselage creaking and groaning under the strain. Harrison had been forced to reduce the aircraft's speed significantly to minimize the stress on the airframe, but this had also increased their fuel consumption and extended their flight time. The delicate balance between reaching their destination safely and having enough fuel to complete the landing had become increasingly precarious as they'd fought their way through the storm's outer bands. Every decision Harrison had made during this phase of the flight had carried life or death consequences, and the margin for error had been essentially eliminated. Martinez had gradually come to appreciate the skill and experience that Harrison was demonstrating as he'd navigated Flight 847 through conditions that would have challenged even the most experienced pilots. The older captain's ability to read the aircraft's behavior and anticipate changes in the weather had been impressive, and his calm demeanor under extreme pressure had helped maintain order in the cockpit despite the desperate nature of their situation. Martinez had begun to understand why Harrison's experience was valuable, even if his methods sometimes differed from standard procedures. The approach to Kangerlussuaq had required Harrison to hand-fly the aircraft through some of the most challenging conditions he'd encountered in his entire career. The automated flight systems that Martinez preferred to rely on had been unable to cope with the rapidly changing wind conditions and severe turbulence, forcing Harrison to disconnect the autopilot and fly the approach manually. His decades of experience with manual flying had proven invaluable as he'd made constant adjustments to maintain control of the aircraft while fighting through the storm. The weather conditions at Kangerlussuaq had been every bit as challenging as Harrison had feared. The northeast winds had been gusting to 50 knots, creating severe crosswind conditions that would make the landing extremely difficult. Snow squalls had been reducing visibility intermittently, and the runway surface had been contaminated with patches of ice and snow that would affect braking performance. The approach lighting system had been minimal, consisting of basic runway lights without the sophisticated instrument landing systems that commercial pilots were accustomed to using. Harrison had been forced to execute a visual approach to Kangerlussuaq's runway, relying on his ability to judge distance and altitude. Without the assistance of precision approach equipment, the crosswinds had required him to maintain a significant crab angle during the approach, pointing the aircraft's nose into the wind to maintain alignment with the runway centerline. The technique, known as a crab-it approach, was challenging. Under the best of circumstances and extremely difficult in the severe wind conditions they were experiencing. The final approach had been a masterclass in aviation skill and judgment that would later be studied by flight instructors and safety experts around the world. Harrison had managed the aircraft's energy precisely, adjusting power settings and flight controls continuously to compensate for wind gusts and changes in direction. The Boeing 777 had pitched and rolled through the turbulent air as Harrison had fought to maintain control, but his steady hands and experienced eye had kept them on the proper glide path toward the runway. The landing itself had been a tour, the force of piloting skill that had demonstrated why experience could never be fully replaced by technology or youth. Harrison had executed a crosswind landing technique that had required him to kick out the crab angle at the last possible moment, aligning the aircraft with the runway center line while simultaneously compensating for the strong crosswinds. The main landing gear had touched down firmly but smoothly on the icy runway surface, and Harrison had immediately deployed the aircraft's thrust reversers and wheel brakes to bring the massive jet to a stop before reaching the end of the 9,000-foot runway. The relief in the cockpit had been palpable as Flight 847 had rolled to a stop on the remote Greenland airstrip, but Harrison had known that their challenges were far from over. They had successfully avoided Hurricane Delilah and had landed safely. But they were now stranded in one of the most remote locations on Earth with 319 people who needed food, shelter, and warmth in sub-freezing temperatures. The small terminal building at Kangerlussuaq was designed to accommodate perhaps 50 people, and there were no hotels, restaurants, or other facilities that could support the needs of Flight 847's passengers and crew. Harrison had immediately contacted the Kangerlussuaq station manager by radio, explaining their emergency situation and requesting assistance with passenger care and aircraft servicing. The station manager, a Danish meteorologist named Erik Andersen, who had been working at the remote facility for over a decade, had been stunned to learn that a commercial airliner had landed at his airstrip. Andersen had explained that while the facility had basic heating and some emergency supplies, it was not equipped to handle a large group of passengers for any extended period. The immediate priority had been getting passengers off the aircraft and into the terminal building before the Arctic cold could become life-threatening. The temperature outside had been -15 degrees Celsius with strong winds, creating dangerous wind chill conditions that could cause frostbite within minutes for anyone not properly dressed for the environment. Most of the passengers had been dressed for arrival in London's relatively mild October weather, not for survival in the Greenlandic Arctic. Harrison had worked with the cabin crew to organize an orderly evacuation of the aircraft, ensuring that passengers were moved quickly into the terminal building while minimizing their exposure to the extreme cold. The aircraft's auxiliary power unit had been kept running to maintain heat in the cabin, but the priority had been getting everyone into the heated terminal building as quickly as possible. Several elderly passengers and small children had required special assistance due to their vulnerability to the cold conditions. The terminal building at Kangerlussuaq had been a stark reminder of just how remote their location was. The facility consisted of a single large room with basic seating, small kitchen area, and minimal restroom facilities. The heating system, while adequate for the building's normal occupancy, had been overwhelmed by the sudden arrival of over 300 additional people. Erik Andersen and his small staff had done their best to make everyone comfortable, but the reality of their situation had been sobering for passengers who had expected to wake up in London. Harrison had spent the hours following their arrival coordinating with various agencies and organizations to arrange for rescue and support operations. The first priority had been ensuring that passengers remained warm and fed while they waited for assistance to arrive. Anderson had activated emergency protocols that brought additional heating equipment and emergency supplies from other research stations in Greenland. But it had become clear that they would need outside assistance to handle such a large group of stranded passengers. The Danish government had been contacted about the emergency landing, and they had immediately begun coordinating with international rescue organizations to provide assistance. The scale of the operation had been unprecedented, requiring the mobilization of multiple aircraft and ships to evacuate passengers from the remote Greenland location. The Danish military had volunteered to provide logistical support, while airlines had begun arranging for replacement aircraft to transport passengers to their final destinations. Meanwhile, Hurricane Delilah had continued its devastating path across the North Atlantic, confirming that Harrison's decision to divert to Kangerlussuaq had saved hundreds of lives. The storm had passed directly through the air corridors that Flight 847 would have been using if they had continued on their original route, creating wind conditions and turbulence that would have been unsurvivable for any aircraft. Several other flights that had attempted to continue toward Europe had been forced to make emergency landings after encountering severe structural damage from the hurricane's effects. The weather conditions that had prevented Flight 847 from reaching conventional airports had also made it impossible for rescue aircraft to reach Kangerlussuaq immediately. The storm's influence had extended across much of the North Atlantic region, grounding aircraft and preventing ships from operating safely in the dangerous seas created by the hurricane. Harrison and his passengers had faced the prospect of being stranded in Greenland for several days while weather conditions improved enough to allow rescue operations to proceed. The situation had tested Harrison's leadership abilities as much as his flying skills. The passengers had been understandably anxious about their situation, stranded in a remote location with minimal facilities and uncertain prospects for rescue. Harrison had taken responsibility for communicating with passengers about their status, providing regular updates about rescue efforts, and working to maintain morale during what had been an extremely stressful situation for everyone involved. The first rescue flights had been able to reach Kangerlussuaq 3 days after Hurricane Delilah had passed, bringing additional supplies and beginning the process of evacuating passengers to more comfortable accommodations. The operation had required multiple flights by smaller aircraft that could operate safely from the limited facilities at Kangerlussuaq, and it had taken more than a week to transport all of Flight 847's passengers to their final destinations. During their time stranded in Greenland, passengers had begun to understand the skill and judgment that Harrison had demonstrated in saving their lives. The alternative scenarios that had been available to them had all involved flying directly into Hurricane Delilah's path, which would have resulted in certain death for everyone on board. Harrison's decision to divert to an unknown airstrip in one of the most remote locations on Earth had been the difference between survival and catastrophe. Dr. Sarah Chun, the pediatric surgeon who had been traveling to a medical conference in London, had been among the passengers who had expressed gratitude to Harrison for his handling of the crisis. She had realized that his experience and judgment had been the key factors in their survival, and that a younger or less experienced pilot might not have had the knowledge or confidence to attempt such a challenging diversion. The successful landing at Kangerlussuaq had required skills that could only be developed through decades of flying experience. Marcus Thompson, the software engineer who had been relocating to London, had also come to appreciate Harrison's expertise during their time in Greenland. Thompson had initially been frustrated by the delay and inconvenience of being stranded in the Arctic, but as he had learned more about the hurricane and the dangerous conditions they had avoided, he had realized that Harrison had saved their lives through his quick thinking and skilled flying. Alina Rodriguez, the retired teacher who had been visiting her daughter in England, had been particularly vocal in her praise for Harrison's handling of the crisis. Rodriguez had flown extensively throughout her life and had understood better than many passengers just how difficult the landing at Kangerlussuaq must have been. She had made a point of thanking Harrison personally for his skill and courage in bringing them all to safety under such challenging circumstances. The cabin crew had also expressed their admiration for Harrison's performance during the crisis. Purser Patricia Williams had been flying for over 20 years and had experienced various emergency situations, but she had never witnessed such a display of piloting skill under extreme pressure. Williams had noted that Harrison's calm demeanor and clear communication had been essential factors in maintaining order during the emergency, and that his leadership had been exemplary throughout the crisis. First Officer Martinez had undergone a profound change in her assessment of Harrison during their experience with Hurricane Delilah. The crisis had demonstrated the value of experience and intuition in ways that no amount of simulator training could replicate, and Martinez had gained a new appreciation for the knowledge that Harrison had accumulated during his decades of flying. She had realized that her initial criticism of his methods had been based on a narrow understanding of what it meant to be a skilled pilot. The successful resolution of the Flight 847 crisis had attracted international attention and had sparked discussions about the value of experience in aviation. Harrison's handling of the emergency had been studied by aviation safety experts, who had concluded that his combination of technical skill, sound judgment, and extensive experience had been essential factors in the successful outcome. The incident had been cited as an example of why airlines should value experienced pilots rather than viewing age as a liability. Eric Andersen, the Danish meteorologist who had managed the Kangerlussuaq station during the crisis, had been impressed by Harrison's professionalism and competence throughout the ordeal. Andersen had noted that Harrison had remained calm and focused despite the enormous pressure he had faced, and that his decisions had consistently prioritized the safety and welfare of his passengers and crew. The meteorologist had later commented that Harrison's performance had been exemplary under some of the most challenging conditions he had ever witnessed. The international rescue operation that had been required to evacuate passengers from Kangerlussuaq had involved coordination between multiple countries and organizations. The Danish government had taken the lead in providing immediate assistance, while the United States and Canada had contributed aircraft and personnel to support the evacuation efforts. The complexity and scale of the operation had demonstrated the challenges involved in handling aviation emergencies in remote locations. Hurricane Delilah had eventually weakened as it had moved over cooler waters north of the main shipping lanes, but not before causing significant disruption to North Atlantic air traffic. The storm had been classified as one of the most intense hurricanes ever recorded in the region, and its rapid development and movement had caught meteorologists and aviation officials off guard. The incident had led to improvements in weather forecasting and communication systems designed to provide better warning of rapidly developing storm systems. The Boeing 777 that had been used for Flight 847 had been thoroughly inspected by maintenance crews after the emergency landing at Kangerlussuaq. Despite the severe turbulence and challenging conditions the aircraft had encountered, the inspection had revealed no structural damage or significant wear beyond normal parameters. The aircraft's robust design and Harrison's skilled handling had prevented the kind of structural damage that could have resulted from less experienced piloting during such extreme conditions. The fuel analysis conducted after the landing had confirmed how close Flight 847 had come to a catastrophic fuel shortage. When the aircraft had shut down its engines at Kangerlussuaq, the fuel gauges had shown less than 20 minutes of flying time remaining. Harrison's fuel management and navigation during the crisis had been precise enough to bring them to safety with virtually no margin for error, demonstrating the accuracy of his calculations and the soundness of his decision-making. Under extreme pressure, the investigation into the Flight 847 incident had been conducted by multiple aviation safety agencies, including the National Transportation Safety Board, the Federal Aviation Administration, and international aviation authorities. The investigation had focused on the decision-making process that had led to the successful diversion to Kangerlussuaq, as well as the performance of aircraft systems and crew procedures during the emergency. The investigation had concluded that Harrison's actions had been appropriate and had likely prevented a much more serious incident. The passengers of Flight 847 had formed lasting bonds during their unexpected stay in Greenland, and many had remained in contact long after reaching their final destinations. The shared experience of surviving Hurricane Delilah had created a sense of community among people who might never have spoken to each other under normal circumstances. Several passengers had organized reunion events to commemorate their experience and to maintain the friendships that had been formed during their time in the Arctic. The story of Flight 847 had been covered extensively by international media, with Harrison being portrayed as a hero who had saved hundreds of lives through his skill and experience. However, Harrison had consistently deflected praise for his actions, emphasizing that he had simply done his job and that the successful outcome had been the result of teamwork between the flight crew, cabin crew, and ground personnel who had supported the emergency response. The incident had also sparked discussions within the aviation industry about the mandatory retirement age for commercial pilots and the value of experience in handling emergency situations. Some aviation experts had argued that Harrison's performance demonstrated why experienced pilots should be retained rather than forced into retirement based solely on age, while others had maintained that standardized procedures and advanced technology were more important than individual experience. TransGlobal Airways had initially been concerned about the negative publicity that might result from having one of their aircraft stranded in the Arctic, but the positive coverage of Harrison's heroic actions had actually enhanced the airline's reputation. The company had received numerous messages of support from passengers and aviation professionals who had praised the airline for employing pilots of Harrison's caliber. The incident had been seen as validation of TransGlobal's commitment to safety and the quality of their flight operations. The aftermath of Flight 847's emergency landing had reverberations that extended far beyond the immediate rescue operation. Within days of the incident, aviation safety organizations worldwide had begun analyzing Harrison's decisions and techniques, recognizing that his handling of the crisis represented a masterclass in emergency aviation management. The Federal Aviation Administration had requested detailed debriefings from both Harrison and Martinez, seeking to understand the decision-making process that had led to such a successful outcome under seemingly impossible circumstances. Harrison's reputation within the aviation community had been transformed overnight from that of an aging pilot clinging to his career to that of a seasoned professional whose experience had proven invaluable when technology and standard procedures had fallen short. The irony had not been lost on many observers that the same qualities that had been criticized as outdated just weeks earlier had ultimately saved the lives of everyone aboard. Flight 847. His intuitive understanding of weather patterns, his ability to think creatively under pressure, and his willingness to make difficult decisions based on incomplete information had all been crucial factors in their survival. The incident had also sparked a broader conversation within TransGlobal Airways about their approach to pilot retention and the value they placed on experience. Chief Pilot Robert Chun, who had previously suggested that Harrison consider early retirement, had found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge that the airline's most senior pilot had just performed one of the most remarkable saves in commercial aviation history. The early retirement program that had been designed to push out older pilots had been quietly suspended while the company reassessed its policies regarding age and experience. Chun had requested a private meeting with Harrison upon his return to service, ostensibly to debrief the Flight 847 incident. but also to address the tension that had existed between them prior to the emergency. The conversation had been awkward initially, with Chun struggling to reconcile his previous concerns about Harrison's adaptability with the undeniable evidence of his exceptional performance during the crisis. Harrison had been gracious in accepting Chun's acknowledgement of his handling of the emergency, but both men had understood that their professional relationship had been fundamentally altered by the events over the North Atlantic. The meeting had evolved into a broader discussion about the future of aviation and the role that experienced pilots should play in an increasingly automated industry. Chun had admitted that his previous focus on standardization and technology had perhaps undervalued the importance of human judgment and experience in handling truly exceptional situations. Harrison had acknowledged that the industry was changing and that pilots needed to adapt to new technologies, but he had also emphasized that experience remained crucial for situations that fell outside the parameters of standard procedures. First Officer Jennifer Martinez had perhaps undergone the most significant transformation in her perspective as a result of the Flight 847 incident. Her initial report questioning Harrison's decision-making had been quietly withdrawn, and she had submitted a new evaluation that praised his performance and acknowledged the value of his experience. Martinez had realized that her previous criticism had been based on a narrow understanding of what constituted good piloting, and she had begun to appreciate that effective aviation safety required a balance between technological capability and human judgment. The relationship between Harrison and Martinez had evolved from one of mutual suspicion to one of professional respect and collaboration. Martinez had requested to continue flying as Harrison's first officer, recognizing that she could learn valuable lessons from his approach to aviation that could not be taught in simulators or training programs. Their subsequent flights together had been characterized by open communication and shared decision-making, with Martinez contributing her technical expertise while Harrison provided the broader perspective that came from decades of experience. The passengers of Flight 847 had also played a role in reshaping perceptions of Harrison's performance. Many had written letters to TransGlobal Airways, expressing their gratitude for Harrison's skill and professionalism during the crisis, and several had specifically mentioned their confidence in flying with experienced pilots. Dr. Sarah Shun had written an article for a medical journal about the importance of experience and judgment in high-pressure situations, drawing parallels between Harrison's aviation expertise and the skills required in emergency medicine. Marcus Thompson had used his technology background to create a detailed analysis of the Flight 847 incident, examining the various factors that had contributed to the successful outcome. His analysis had highlighted the limitations of automated systems in handling truly exceptional situations, and had emphasized the importance of human decision-making when standard procedures proved inadequate. Thompson's work had been widely circulated within the aviation industry and had contributed to ongoing discussions about the appropriate balance between automation and human control in modern aircraft. Elena Rodriguez had become something of an advocate for experienced pilots, using her background in education to speak at aviation conferences about the value of institutional knowledge and the importance of learning from veterans in any field. Her presentations had resonated with audiences who recognized parallels between aviation and their own professions, where experience and judgment remained crucial despite technological advances. The broader aviation industry had taken notice of the Flight 847 incident, with several airlines reviewing their policies regarding pilot retention and mandatory retirement. The International Air Transport Association had commissioned a study examining the relationship between pilot experience and safety outcomes, seeking to determine whether the industry's focus on standardization had perhaps gone too far in devaluing individual expertise and judgment. Hurricane Delilah itself had been the subject of extensive meteorological analysis, with researchers trying to understand the factors that had contributed to its rapid intensification and erratic movement. The storm had challenged existing weather prediction models and had highlighted the limitations of current forecasting technology in predicting extreme weather events. The incident had led to improvements in how weather information was communicated to aircraft in flight, with new protocols designed to provide more timely and accurate updates about rapidly changing conditions. The Kangerlussuaq airstrip had gained international attention as a result of the Flight 847 incident, with aviation authorities recognizing its potential value as an emergency diversion airport for transatlantic flights. The Danish government had invested in upgrading the facility's emergency response capabilities and had established agreements with international aviation organizations to ensure that the airstrip could be used effectively in future emergency situations. Eric Anderson, the meteorologist who had managed the emergency response at Kangerlussuaq, had been recognized for his professionalism and competence during the crisis. His ability to coordinate the complex logistics of housing and feeding over 300 unexpected guests in one of the world's most remote locations had been crucial to the successful outcome of the incident. Anderson had later been promoted to a senior position within the Danish Meteorological Service, where he had worked to improve emergency response procedures for remote facilities. The Boeing 777 that had been used for Flight 847 had been returned to service after extensive maintenance and inspection, but it had been unofficially designated as Harrison's regular aircraft by TransGlobal Scheduling Department. The aircraft had been equipped with a commemorative plaque recognizing the successful emergency landing at Kangerlussuaq, and many passengers had specifically requested to fly on the aircraft that had gained fame for its remarkable survival story. Harrison himself had been reluctant to embrace the hero status that had been thrust upon him by media coverage of the incident. He had consistently emphasized that his actions had been the result of training, experience, and teamwork rather than individual heroism. However, he had gradually come to accept that his story had value in demonstrating the importance of experience and judgment in aviation, and he had begun participating in safety seminars and training programs where he could share his knowledge with younger pilots. The Flight 847 incident had been incorporated into aviation training curricula worldwide, with flight instructors using Harrison's decision-making process as a case study in emergency management. The incident had demonstrated the importance of creative thinking, risk assessment, and decisive action when faced with situations that fell outside standard operating procedures. Student pilots had been encouraged to study Harrison's approach to the crisis as an example of how experience and judgment could be applied effectively under extreme pressure. TransGlobal Airways had eventually offered Harrison a position as a senior training captain, recognizing that his experience and expertise could be valuable in developing the next generation of pilots. The position had allowed Harrison to continue flying while also sharing his knowledge through instruction and mentoring activities. He had accepted the role enthusiastically, seeing it as an opportunity to contribute to aviation safety while helping younger pilots develop the skills and judgment they would need to handle future emergencies. The early retirement program that had been designed to encourage older pilots to leave the airline had been completely restructured following the Flight 847 incident. Instead of focusing solely on age as a factor in pilot retention, TransGlobal had developed a more nuanced approach that considered experience, performance, and the ability to adapt to changing technology. The new program had emphasized mentoring and knowledge transfer, recognizing that experienced pilots had valuable insights that could benefit the entire organization. Harrison's relationship with airline management had been fundamentally transformed by the incident, with executives who had previously viewed him as a potential liability now recognizing him as one of their most valuable assets. The successful outcome of Flight 847 had demonstrated that experience remained crucial in aviation, and that the industry's rush to embrace technology and standardization should not come at the expense of human judgment and expertise. The story of Flight 847 had resonated beyond the aviation industry, becoming a symbol of the value of experience and the importance of trusting seasoned professionals when faced with unprecedented challenges. Harrison's calm competence under extreme pressure had reminded people that expertise could not be easily replaced by technology or youth, and that there remained situations where human judgment and experience were irreplaceable. Years later, Harrison would reflect on the Flight 847 incident as the defining moment of his career, not because it had brought him fame or recognition, but because it had validated his lifelong commitment to aviation safety and professionalism. The crisis had tested every aspect of his knowledge and skill, and the successful outcome had confirmed that his decades of experience had genuine value in ensuring the safety of the flying public. The passengers and crew of Flight 847 had remained connected through social media and regular reunion gatherings, celebrating not just their survival but the bonds they had formed during their unexpected Arctic adventure. Many had described the experience as life-changing, not just because of the danger they had faced, but because of the way it had demonstrated the importance of competence, leadership, and teamwork in overcoming seemingly impossible challenges. Harrison had continued flying for several more years after the Flight 847 incident, eventually retiring at the age of 71 with over 35,000 flight hours and an unblemished safety record. His final flight had been an emotional occasion, with passengers, crew members, and airline executives gathering to honor his contributions to aviation safety and his role in saving the lives of the 319 people aboard. Flight 847, the legacy of Captain William Harrison and Flight 847 had become part of aviation folklore, a story that reminded pilots, passengers, and industry executives that experience, judgment, and competence remained crucial elements of aviation safety. The incident had demonstrated that while technology and standardization were important, they could not replace the value of seasoned professionals who possessed the knowledge and confidence to make life-or-death decisions when standard procedures proved inadequate. In an industry that had sometimes seemed to prioritize efficiency and cost-cutting over experience and expertise, the Flight 847 incident had served as a powerful reminder that aviation safety ultimately depended on the skill and judgment of the human beings responsible for operating aircraft. Harrison's performance during the crisis had shown that age could be an asset rather than a liability, and that the wisdom gained through decades of experience remained invaluable when faced with situations that no training program could fully anticipate. The thunderous applause that had erupted in the Kangerlussuaq terminal when passengers had learned they were all safe had been more than just relief at their survival. It had been recognition of what true expertise looked like under pressure, and an acknowledgement that sometimes the most powerful response to those who doubt your abilities is simply to prove them wrong when it matters most. Captain William Harrison had done exactly that, transforming skepticism about his age into admiration for his competence, and ensuring that his name would be remembered not as a pilot who flew too long, but as one who flew exactly long enough to save 319 lives when experience mattered more than youth. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.